Unbelievable. Well, actually, in British Columbia, where First Nation activists can forbid non-Indigenous Canadians from entering public spaces, and where courts recognize Aboriginal title over private property of non-Aboriginals, and where bands can cash in on millions of taxpayer dollars to excavate after falsely claiming to have discovered Indigenous children's remains, only to then not excavate, I guess what I'm about to tell you is pretty believable. Brace yourselves. A Supreme Court judge has granted a sealing order on the grounds of someone being Indigenous. That's right. Right now, if you want to avoid public scrutiny in this case, you're the Law Society of BC, which is being sued for defamation by one of its own members. You don't need to be a minor. You don't need to be guarding a trade secret or discussing something to do with our national security. Nope, you just need to be Indigenous. Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News. And do you remember a Vancouver Island-based lawyer named Jim, aka James Heller? I've interviewed Heller a few times before because he's in a battle for truth after he says he was defamed and vilified by the Law Society of BC. After trying to have them correct residential school misinformation they've been peddling through their mandatory Indigenous intercultural training, which was teaching lawyers, by the way, that the lie that hundreds of children's remains have been discovered in unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School is true. And here's where things get really unbelievable. The Law Society applied to have one of Heller's recent affidavits sealed so that I can't report on what it said, which means you can't scrutinize the Law Society's communications within it. And the reason for their request, well, it's because the communications they don't want you to see involve discussions with a person who is Indigenous. That's it. Not some sort of victim of a human trafficking ring, just an Indigenous person, and thus would be harmful if the public combed through those communications. That's it. That's the bar for which Justice K. Wolf went ahead and granted the affidavit Heller filed to be sealed entirely, at least for now. Heller and his lawyer, Paul Jaffe, will have opportunity to argue against it being sealed in an upcoming hearing in October. But should they have to? Instead of working through the usual tests for sealing that I've come across when covering cases, including a murder and sexual abuse case of a minor, usually judges take time to order redactions that could protect legitimate privacy interests without keeping the public completely in the dark. But Justice Wolf's reasons default to sealing the whole thing in one swoop, saying she isn't satisfied that it would be a reasonable alternative in the circumstances to redact. Heller's lawyer had suggested that redactions take place. Why not just cover up some names, make sure the emails are hidden? What does race have to do with any of this? Judge Wolf decided that wouldn't sufficiently protect the privacy interests at stake. But aside from saying the person is Indigenous doesn't explain what is actually at stake here, or how this person would experience harm if you knew what I can't report on. So I guess if you're Indigenous, you're above scrutiny these days because bad things happen to your ancestors, just like bad things happen to everybody's ancestors. In other words, convenience outweighs transparency for now. Justice Wolf was really nice to me, by the way. I attended the hearing virtually, and I'm used to just quietly listening and taking notes when I do that, so it was a little different to hear her address me by name more than once, simply kind of checking up to see if I was comfortable, maybe still awake. I don't know. But I was comfortable, just confused. Confused as to why it seemed the court was dancing around what was a huge elephant in the room. When Justice Wolf gave her version of what the heart of Heller's lawsuit is, she ignores the substance of his claim, which is that the Law Society published a statement accusing Heller of being racist when all he did was tell the truth, and asked that they do the same when it comes to residential school unmarked grave misinformation that the Law Society was spreading. So for the public's sake, let me break down that important background that the courts couldn't muster, and in fact that Justice Wolf claims is unrelated to Heller's defamation case. You tell me if you agree. In 2023, Judge Shelley Fitzpatrick sentenced eco-criminal Miranda Dick, who happens to be Indigenous, to 28 days in jail after she obstructed the Trans Mountain Pipeline in contempt of court. Her social justice lawyer, Benjamin Isset, later argued that she should get a lighter sentence under GLADU principles that require judges to consider an Indigenous offender's background and historical harms for sentencing. But in this case, Isset used harms that were never historically proven in saying that Dick should receive a lesser sentence because she is a member of the Tecumseh First Nation in Kamloops, where 215 children's bodies had been unearthed. As many of you now know from years of my reports and my documentary, that is false. And Fitzpatrick, being a wise judge, corrected him and the record in saying probable graves had been discovered. Well, that truth, like always, was met with outrage, this time from gallery attendants accusing her of being a racist residential school denier. And Miranda Dick's lawyer seemed to agree because he took that case to an appeal on the grounds of Fitzpatrick being biased and having engaged in denialism. Thankfully, that case was dismissed. In fact, it was dismissed by Chief Justice Marchand, an Indigenous judge who was raised in Kamloops, who confirmed that Fitzpatrick wasn't racist, she was just right. The whole thing is an embarrassment to the courts, and naturally, wanting to prevent it from happening again, Jim Heller and another lawyer brought forth a resolution last year seeking for the Law Society of BC to revise its mandatory training, which read that on May 27th of 2021, that nation discovered an unmarked burial site that contained the bodies of 215 children on the former Kamloops Indian Residential School grounds. You would think that after that fiasco in the courts, the revisions would have been a no-brainer in our legal system, but they weren't. Instead, identity politics for the win, and the resolution narrowly failed, mostly because so many lawyers were too scared to show up and vote for the truth. But what was even more concerning than that of Fitzpatrick being screamed at in her courtroom was the fact that the Law Society, which is supposed to be impartial, picked a side, not just by refusing to correct the propaganda in its course, but to publish on its own website a statement from the BC First Nations Justice Council that blatantly labeled Heller's resolution as a racist resolution proposed by Law Society of British Columbia members that supports residential school and genocide denialism. And that didn't say cultural genocide, like the Truth and Reconciliation report does. No, just genocide. At this point, more like a phantom genocide, since out of the over 100 bans that have followed the Kamloops in similar unmarked grave claims, none of them have produced a single body on any of these sites, although it's been profitable to claim they're there. Imagine being a lawyer and having an Indigenous political council falsely label you a racist, and then your own governing body, the Law Society, that you pay your dues to and controls your license, publishes that statement. That's gotta hurt. And the extra salt on the wounds, of course, is that the courts now appear to be doubling down on race-based shields against objective truth. You should know that after months of Jim Heller calling out the Law Society for all of this, they finally changed the wording of their mandatory course to reflect something closer to the truth, but still, no apology, no retraction, no accountability. And with this latest attempt to prevent you from seeing their communications simply because they involved someone Indigenous, no transparency either. Drea Humphrey for Rebel News. Rebel News is your trusted source to bring you the other side of the story, even if it's an unpopular truth. If you appreciate the reports that we've done, including a tell-all documentary before outlets on both sides were comfortable talking about this important issue, consider chipping in to keep our reports going strong, to expose the truth that unites the people instead of divides them. You can do so by chipping in at kamloopsdocumentary.com.